Hey everyone, it's Vicky and welcome back to another video. So recently I played in the 2025 Texas State Women's Chess Championship held in Plano, Texas, and I'm going to recap two of my games there. So this tournament was quite important. The winner would be crowned the Texas Women's Champion, which meant that there were a lot of very strong players playing. For example, there were FMs, WGMs, and other title players. So I knew it was going to be an uphill battle for me. I was really excited though, and the time control was 40 plus 10, which is quite interesting because it's a little too quick to be classical, but it's also quite a long format for a rapid game. So without further ado, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And now let's get started with game 1. For this first round, I was paired against the number 3 seed, but more importantly, the current Texas Women's Chess Champion, FIDE Master Gergana Peycheva, and I was playing as white. I began with d4, d5, bishop f4, the London, which you know I love. So now she played knight f6, knight f3, e6, e3. So this is currently a symmetrical setup. Now she went c5. This is a strong move. It's good against the London because first of all, it pressures this pawn on d4. Secondly, you move the pawn out so that you can develop the knight after the pawn, and therefore you have more space both for the pawn and the knight. Now I went knight d2 to just develop my other knight and complete this London pyramid over here. Now she decided to take the center pawn. I took back with my e-pawn. You always want to capture toward the center, and I typically prefer capturing with the e-pawn so that these three pawns are still in a line, all protecting each other. Here she went knight h5, so I had two main options I was considering. I could have gone bishop e3. I did not do this because I'm just not very used to playing positions where I'm retreating my bishop back toward the center. I play a lot more games where I retreat my bishop to g3 instead, and while my opponent can take my bishop, which she did, I can take back with my h-pawn, and now my rook is opened up on this semi-open file and can possibly have long-term pressure on this pawn on h7. So now she went g6 and I went bishop d3. Now, I thought about going bishop e2, which is normally what you want to do if your opponent goes g6, since what I did. Now my bishop is eyeing the g6 pawn, but the g6 pawn is already defended by two other pawns, so it's sort of not really looking at anything, but I felt like this was a more active move, and maybe long-term I can have more attacking chances with my bishop on d3. My opponent then developed her bishop. I castled and she castled. So here I was faced with a decision to make now that all my minor pieces are developed and I've castled. So I decided to go queen b3. In hindsight, this was probably not the best move, but I wanted a way to activate my queen, and I felt like the b3 square, at least it eyed the pawn on b7, so my opponent couldn't move the bishop easily. Here my opponent went b6. I went rook e1, developing my rook, and my opponent went bishop b7, fianchettoing both of her bishops, so now they're pointing at all of these long diagonals. Okay, so now I went a4. I thought, why not? Even though it's quite an aggressive move, not particularly my style, I still enjoy pushing the flank pawns, and I didn't know what else to do, so I went for a4, potentially with ideas of going a5 in the future. And this bishop over here is loose, so the pawn can never take it, or else I'll take the bishop with my queen. My opponent went queen c7, I went rook c1, just so my rook is now eyeing the queen, and my opponent went rook a to c8. Here I felt like all of my pieces were already on their optimal squares. Then I was considering, is there any way for me to improve one of my pieces? Is one of my pieces in now an awkward position? And I felt like my queen over here was not doing very much. The knight could always go on a5 and attack my queen, so I considered rerouting my queen, which is why I went back to d1. My opponent went rook f to e8, now all her rooks are developed too, and I went back to rook a1 because now I felt like I wanted to protect my pawn an extra time on a4, and I didn't feel like my rook was doing much on c1. Here she went f6, her plan is to go e5, so I went knight b3, and after she went e5, I took the pawn, she took back, and I went bishop to b5. I was actually feeling pretty good about this move because Now, if the knight ever moves, I'll take the rook, of course, and I'm also currently attacking this pawn on d5. So here she defended her pawn, and I went queen e2, potentially putting more pressure on the e5 pawn in the center. She went queen c8, and I went a5, taking advantage of the pin still on the rook. And here my opponent went a6, which meant that I had to take the knight, because if I retreated to a4, then the bishop would get trapped, and if I retreated to d3, then it would get forked. So after I took the knight, she took back with the queen, I took the pawn, and after all of these trades, I decided to drop my knight back to d2. This was a mistake, but I just felt like if I put my knight on the rim, you know, the saying, knights on the rim are grim, I didn't feel like it had much life here. Sure, it's currently attacking the bishop, but after the bishop drops back, I don't really have any good squares for my knight here. Now, after I drop my knight back to d2, my opponent has a very strong move, which is e4. It's important to note that the queen can't take this pawn on b2, since I have rook a to b1, and after the queen takes on c3, I can take the bishop. And then I would be up a piece for 2 pawns, which is good for me. So after e4, I had to move my knight, and I decided to move it to g5. This was also not great because now my opponent could play bishop h6, and now I have to move my knight again. So I moved it back to h3, and here my opponent played e3, which is not the best move. Here my opponent should have actually just taken this pawn on b2, and if I try to go rook b1 again, then my opponent can take on c3. If I take on b7, then my opponent can take my knight on d2 since it's no longer double defended. And after all of these trades, I would just be down 2 pawns and be losing. So that would have been not good for me. But after my opponent played e3, I was able to drop my knight back. I couldn't have taken here because then my opponent would just take us the rook and everything is collapsing here. So now my opponent found the best move again. She played d4 and I took, which was the best, and she took with the rook, which was actually a mistake because now I can take with my knight, and this is equal again actually, surprisingly. I'm still up a pawn, which is nice, and right now she has no way of attacking my king. So she took, I took back, and after this move, I was not sure how to defend this pawn on b2. I was evaluating all my options, and ultimately I settled on rook a2, which looks like an ugly move, but it still maintains equality. I didn't want to do something like rook d1 because then the bishop could just attack my rook, but here it's technically still fine because I'm still up a pawn, so I can afford to lose one. And I could have just played something like rook to d1, and after she took this pawn, I could play rook to d2, and this is still equal. But instead, I moved my rook to a2, she went rook to b3, I gave a check, and here is when I made the fatal mistake. Instead of moving my rook to f1, which is what I did, I should have just moved my king to h2. This is a great move. The engine says it's plus 0.3, so it's pretty equal, but I have some good chances here. And my king is somewhat safe here. Black's king is a little bit exposed, and I felt like this would have given me some good chances of at least drawing. But I played the wrong move order. I was going to move my king to h2, but instead I moved my rook first, and this allowed my opponent to check my king. And here I just completely collapsed. I have very little time. I went king h1, which immediately blundered mate in 5. I'll pause for a few seconds here to see if you can spot it. Alright, so my opponent wins bishop takes g2, and after I took it back, she could take the pawn on g3 was check, and then my king is mated. So that was not great, but I survived for 33 moves, and it was still a completely equal position, even slightly better for me at some points. But anyways, what can you do? It was a tough game. I was still proud of how I played and excited to play more stronger players. Okay, so for this second round, I was paired up against Women International Master Rachael, and she's rated 2356, which means that she was the number 2 seed, and you'd think I'd get an easier opponent after a round 1 loss, but no, because she had a bye for the first round, that meant that we got paired together, so this was going to be another challenge for me. I was playing with the black pieces this time, and she opened with e4, I went c5, and she went knight c3, which is the closed Sicilian. Now I have some experience playing against the closed Sicilian, but most typically people play the open Sicilian, which is characterized by knight f3, d6, d4, and takes. And this is the open Sicilian. Here we have a bunch of different moves that you can play as black as well as white, but we're not going to go into that. We're going to go into what actually happened. So after I played d6, she went g3, and I went g6, and we both fianchettoed our bishops. Now she went e3, I developed my knight, she developed her bishop, and we just continued developing our pieces. I'll fast forward it a little bit. And here I went rook b8, so I have potential ideas of going b5 and starting an attack on the queen side. Here she went queen d2 and I went b5, which was my plan all along. Here this is still completely equal. In fact, I can see that this exact position has been reached 2 times already by 2 masters based on the Lichess Masters database. Now here she castled, deviating from what the 2 masters played, which was bishop h6, and here I would castle, and this would still be equal, but my king would be a little bit more exposed now that my bishop on g7 is gone. But after she castled, I went b4, attacking the knight, so she had to drop it back. And here I finally castled, and now she went f4, which is quite aggressive, signaling she wants to immediately start attacking my king. So here I went a5, and she went c3. Here my best move is actually going a4, and if she took this pawn, then I take back with my rook, and now this pawn on d3 and this pawn on b2 are both slightly weak, while my rook is activated on b4. But instead, I went queen b6, which is also a good move, but here she can go d4. I took, which I should not have done. Instead, I should have just actually dropped my bishop back to c8, and if she took one of these pawns, I can just take back, and if she took again, then I'll take back with my a pawn, and this is just better for me. So I should have just left the tension, but after I took, she's able to take back with the c pawn, and I moved my queen up to b5, which now allowed her to push d5, and after I retreated my knight, she could place her knight on d4, and I had to retreat my queen again. So I went to a6, and this is already looking a little bit tough for me. White is slightly better just because her pieces are better positioned. Mine are all kind of retreating back to the starting position, but it's okay. I kept on trying. After she moved knight f2, I went knight b7, which was a mistake because she can now go knight c6, which I had just overlooked, because if I take the knight and I take again, then she has e5, and now I have to move my queen or block, but now she can take my knight, and after all of the exchanges, I'm simply down a piece for 2 pawns, which is not great. And she has a very strong attack. She's going to eventually win a lot of my other pawns too, and her bishops are very strong. That was not be good for me. So I took once, and then I moved my knight to c5, but now she could play e5 anyway, and after I retreated my knight, she can take, I take back, and now she can go rook to c1, putting even more pressure on my knight on c5, which is only defended by my pawn. So I moved my knight, and then she went bishop to d4, now offering a trade of bishops. My bishop over here is my greatest strength, so I really did not want to trade it, but I didn't have much of a choice. So instead I just moved my rook to c8. After she took, I took back with the knight, and she went knight e4. Now if she took this pawn with her queen, this would still be better for her, but it would be a little bit trickier because now I can take this pawn on b2, or I could have attacked the queen with my rook, and so she didn't even allow me to do that. She attacked my pawn another time with the knight. I tried to defend with my rook, but it's a little bit too late. Here her best move was actually knight f6, and wherever I move my king, then she has f5, and this is just completely breaking down all my defenses. If I took this pawn, then she has queen h6, and this is actually mate in 3, so I can't really do anything about that. But she played b3, which is also very strong. I had to drop my knight back once again, and now here she found the best move, which is going c7, which meant I had to move my rook once again. Now she's able to collect the pawn on d6, and with that also my rook, because if I move my rook then the pawn was going to promote. And here it's completely collapsed for me. I tried to regain the pawn at least, but after all of the trays, she's able to take on f7, and my king here is completely dead. So after a few more moves, I gave one more check, and this was the final position. I just resigned because I would have to give up my queen here, and I don't think anyone wants to play this position, especially against a woman international master. So yeah, that was quite a difficult game. She just completely outplayed me through the middle game. I did at least do well in the opening to get it to an equal position, but she was able to bring all her pieces, attack them, and I had worse defenses. But anyway, it was a very valuable lesson. I'm still glad I played these games. I realized that I did not really showcase any of my losses so far on my YouTube channel, so here we go. There's a lot of room for me still to grow, and I'm excited to see where chess takes me next. So that's all I have for you today. Let me know what you thought of this video, and if you have any feedback or suggestions for future videos. And also, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye!